Test, test. Test, test. Test, test. Test, test.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, it's Tanya.
Hey, Tanya.
Pretty good. How about you?
Well, so I'm trying to figure out if my audio is working. Are you
I can hear you.
getting good audio from me? You can hear me, okay. All right.
Yep, and I can see your slides there.
Okay, I'm not on the presentation view yet, because when I go to presentation view, I can't see the chat. I can't see anything but my presenter notes and the screen. So
Right.
I will be completely dependent on you.
Okay.
And I am fine to be interrupted. Say, hey, there's a question. Can we stop just a minute? Just go right ahead.
Okay.
And I took your suggestion yesterday, and I've been building my framework to think about workforce.
Okay.
So as you'll see, I'll engage you to start, but maybe just to that you, before people come in here, let me see if I can give you just an idea of, so I have people do a little bit about, think about the, when do you think you're going to retire? And look at that big horizon out there. We'll do a little bit of just kind of settling into what we're thinking and how we imagine ourselves in the future. Okay. And then I'll give people kind of an overview. We're going to talk about how we think about future, and then how are we biased in our thinking about the future? How do we get control over that so we can actually do better planning for the future, so we don't fall into the kind of thinking traps that tend to get us in trouble. Okay. So then the next set of questions, and this is where I'm going to play with you a little bit. These are kind of standard questions. Start with thinking about, how did we get here, right? So what are our underlying assumptions about X? I will tell the audience that for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about the public health workforce. And that will be kind of our running example. We can use this method with any number of different types of examples, but that way, at least I'm anchoring them at the beginning.
Okay. I think your audio just messed up.
Did it?
Okay, well, it's come back now.
Yeah, I'm a little anxious about the technology because I'm very comfortable in Zoom. I share my screens, I make small groups, I do a lot of stuff, and this is very different. I've practiced, but it won't let you even come practice. I was able, right before you came on, to make sure I could follow all the instructions in the tutorial. I can't come in and just practice until it's time for my session.
Yeah, it wouldn't let, I couldn't come in and practice either. So I'm like, we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go back to my front people, hopefully. So that's the other thing I was going to ask you. Do you have any idea about what kind of attendance we'll have? How other sessions have people actually logged on? It could be just us, right?
Well, right now it's showing that I think there's 9 other people watching right now with us. So,
okay.
So hopefully we'll have at least, there's 9 of us. I'm not sure how other sessions have been going, with attendance and stuff. I think it's definitely not as many people attending this as what we would if it was an in-person conference.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
With this being the first time we've ever done this, but so hopefully it'll be just more than just me and you.
Yeah. All right. So that 9 number up there, I thought that maybe just 9 people had clicked on this and gone somewhere else. So that is right now suggested that there are 9 people who are logged in on this particular session.
I think that's what it is, because it goes up and down. As I'll see, like in the chat, I'll see where it says somebody entered the session, the number will change. And then, I can't tell when they leave the session, but that number fluctuates, I think, as people come in and leave, if they have to go out for whatever reason, so I think that's what it is. So I think that's the current amount of people that are already logged in right now, I think.
Okay. And this session is not, so those folks may be logged in waiting for us to start, but we don't officially start until 3:15, correct?
Yeah, 3:15, yeah.
3:15, okay. Because that was the other thing, I don't want to start before people think they're supposed to be here, but I see a button that says it's recording right now. So all of this will get trimmed later or whatever, I guess.
I don't know how Kim's going to do that. I really don't.
No, bless her heart. She's
So,
done a
yeah.
lot. She was in another workshop with me for 3 hours yesterday morning or Wednesday. Yeah, yesterday, before all this started.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's taken quite a bit to get this put together. So,
and I know it's always a lot of work. And as you say, even if it's in person, it's a lot of work. The thing that I have been, okay, comes somebody. Hey, Geraldine.
yeah, and see the number changed to 10 now. So I think that's the actual.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, those of you, we see you.
Mm-hmm.
We can't tell you're there, but I am hoping that if you are going to stay in this session, that you'll use the chat to interact. Tanya told me that she's the only one that can talk to me during the session. So I am going to ask you all as we go, and I'll say it again, but please page through the chat, and Tanya will read and interrupt and ask questions. She has my permission to make your voices heard in this session so that what we're talking about works for you. I'm trying to give you things that you can, apply in your real world. So okay, so that's going to I need to know what is that your session number she's tweeting out to let people know?
Yeah, for environmental health, we can get continuing education hours. And so that's her environmental health specialist. That's her number. And she's actually works for Western Carolina.
Western.
Yeah.
Great. Great.
We were trying to keep up with some attendance for people who are wanting to get continuing education hours for the conference.
Good. So some of the people who are in here may, like Geraldine, be indicating they're here or they want to get that credit. They need to let you know. Other people pop out if they're not trying to get credit. They're not. We won't necessarily know who they're. We'll see them come in, but that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was the other thing I was going to ask you. So I did a pre-recorded session that was posted, but it didn't work. And so I don't know. I think some people did go. Kim put up a YouTube link, and I think some people went out and watched it on YouTube. But I have been anxious about whether or not people have been able to do these live sessions. They've gone okay. They've worked.
Yeah, for the most part, they've gone okay. We had a few technical problems with the PowerPoint seems to work okay live, but if there was a video embedded in their presentation or they tried to do that, it just would not work. You couldn't hear the audio. So we were just putting those links to those recorded videos, in the chat so people could go after the live presentation was over and watch them. So yeah, I'm not sure what happened with all the recorded stuff. For environmental health, for me, all of my sessions were live, so I don't know what all happened with everybody else's recorded sessions.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Well, I'm knowing that you've been in. Yeah, the fact that you've been in other live sessions and that by and large, other than the video thing, which I'm not going to do, it's gone well, then I know I'll trust your experience will be what works for us this afternoon.
Yeah, for some reason I could see you and now I can't see you. So I don't know if your internet's not stable. Sometimes if it's not a very stable connection, your picture goes in and out. Or it may be mine.
For that reason, let me close. No, it might be mine. And maybe in the few minutes we have, let me see if I can put up a profile picture. At least people could see a face.
And I may turn my camera off when you
Mhm.
start, so they're not seeing me just sitting here.
Oh, I understand. And because I am in rural Chatham County, it is often with my internet. So I tried to fix it putting my headshot, but it doesn't look like it showed up. So, oh well. People just
Yeah.
have like a little icon.
Yeah, just a little
But is
icon.
my audio okay?
Yeah, I can still hear you talking. Mm. There you go. There, I see you again.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to say hello, I may do that, but once I share my screen, I will turn it off just so that I don't have any buffering. If the internet is a problem, I don't have a
Okay.
lot of bandwidth. So, we just got a couple minutes left. Since we have a small group, I hope people will play with us.
Yeah, it's showing 11 people right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard to gauge how many people were actually going to go to which session, so I couldn't really, until it started, know exactly how many people were going to show up for it. So,
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I also am aware of is, unlike the regular NCPHA program where people get to leave their offices, go to the conference, work with their colleagues, attend sessions, catch up, have lunch. I mean, all of that downtime that is also about building your network is so valuable. And this year, everybody's trying to do their regular jobs and catch up with what's going on around the state. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yep.
So, well, I'm ready whenever you want to kind of introduce the session and set things up. I assume you have some things that you want people to know before I go. So whenever you're ready, I'm ready.
Well, most everybody, just because of the way it does, most everybody was introducing themselves. I didn't really have a whole lot to say to begin with, so that's up to you.
Oh, okay. No, I'm happy to. That's fine.
Okay.
Well, then let me begin by saying hello to those of you who are able to join us. This is a session on how to design the future that you imagine. And I'm Vaughn Mamlin Upshaw. I'm a professor of the practice at the Gillings School of Global Public Health. I am the director of the master's program in leadership and practice. So we have a concentration where people learn some of the skills that we're going to talk about today, and along with other things. I also am the faculty director for the North Carolina Public Health Leadership Institute, which is a continuing education program available to local and state public health leaders. And I am sharing some of the content that I'm sharing with you today. I've shared with people in that audience as well. So hopefully you will find the content here today relevant, will help you in your work as environmental health specialists and public health leaders. And with that, I'll just go ahead and get going. I will say that as I get started today, I am very hopeful that you will take the chat as your communication tool. Tanya and I have agreed that she would interrupt me, ask questions. I am introducing the ideas today, giving examples, asking questions. Please interact via the chat function so that I can hear your questions and help make sure that this presentation is responding to things that you care about or would like to learn about. As we get started, I'd like for you to take a moment and look out across that beautiful Blue Ridge Mountain. And as your eye looks for that farthest ridge, you begin to see further than what you can see from where you are right now. When we think about the future, that's the same kind of thing that we're trying to do in our heads. We're trying to create that picture of where we might go, what that furthest ridge might be, and trying to create that picture in a way that we can see it in our mind's eye. As we're going to be looking at ways to build the muscle of helping us see more clearly into the future and really pick a path that we want to pursue, I'm going to play with the example of the public health workforce in today's session. For those of you who are in this meeting today, think for just a moment and see if you can calculate what it will be when you might retire. Are you going to work another 20 years? Are you just getting started and maybe thinking you'll be 30 years from now? Maybe you're a little more mature career. You're thinking maybe another 10 years or so. As we think about what retirement might look like, many of the people that I've been speaking with over the last few years are saying they might retire in the year 2040, 2050, or even 2055. That's from now. And yet, it's a career. If you think about the end of that career and you look around at the workforce that you are a part of today, what do you imagine when you retire that workforce might look like? What are some of the things right now about the workforce that you are proud of and feel committed to? Do you hope are still there when you're getting your retirement? What are some of the things about the workforce that are happening right now that you hope when you retire, those are taken care of, that those are no longer the issues or the challenges or the frustrations for people working in public health? Keep those pictures and that little bit of imagination in mind as we go through this next hour or so together. And let's see how we might begin to get closer to building the kind of workforce we'd like to see upon your retirement, and how we might begin now to make that happen. So today's session will be looking at what is strategic foresight. We often hear about strategic planning, but strategic foresight goes beyond strategic planning. And I'm going to introduce that to you today and give you a sense of why we might want to use that to strengthen what we typically do. I'm going to start today by talking about our biases. We tend to do certain things because we've done them before. And if that's the way we think the future will work, we will have a future that looks very much like what our present looks like, because we will continue to do the things that we already by default are doing. So in preparing ourselves to think differently about what future we'd like to have. I'm going to have us think a little bit about how bias influences our thinking and how we can get control over our biases so we can be better at correcting our decisions and our choices to reduce kind of our automatic or default modes. And then we're going to take what we've learned about how to manage that thinking process and apply it to a strategic foresight challenge and see how using a strategic foresight approach might have us thinking differently, even in the present or in the short term that typically are part of our strategic planning processes. So let's think for just a moment more about the past and how it shapes where we are now. As we begin to get an anchor on where we are, where we want to go, I said, let's think about the workforce. So take just a second, use the chat, engage with Tanya. What are some of our underlying assumptions about, and if you were doing this for any environmental or COVID or racial equity, where I have X, that's where your issue goes in. Today, we're going to talk about the public health workforce. So that's my X today. But just know that these questions and this method can apply to any of the challenges you might personally want to work with. And if you have pencil and paper and you want to play with your own example, I strongly encourage you to do that. For the purposes of our work today, I'm going to stay with one example so we can just play it out. So let's begin again. What are our underlying assumptions about the public health workforce? Tanya, I know you're out there. I just want to ask if you have any underlying assumptions about the public health workforce.
You're putting me on the spot here.
I am. I have no idea how many people are out there, but I assume you know them and they're your friends and we're just going to hear. Do we think they're young or old? Assumptions.
Well, probably mixed, I would think. I mean, some of my coworkers are older and some of my coworkers are younger. So, I mean, it's with environmental health, it's a wide variety actually of people in the workforce.
All right. And when we think about that workforce, are we more, do you think you're more male, female?
Well, honestly, it used to be more male, I think, but right now people are saying, I have a couple people saying 50-50, you know, in the chat.
Okay.
I was told once when I first started as a health inspector that when I went out to do an inspection, they looked at me and the person said, I thought all health inspectors were old men with gray hair.
Right. There's an assumption.
That's what I was told. I'm like, no, I go, there's female that do this too. And I'm not, at that time I wasn't, you know, that was, you know, over years ago. So yeah. I was a lot younger then. So some people are saying, had somebody say where I am, I would say 90% female.
Okay.
Some are saying it's more mixed.
Okay.
And other people said it used to be more male.
Yeah. All right. So our underlying assumptions and some of the things that I'm hearing, and I hope people will keep putting things in the chat because this is good. So underlying assumptions might be in the public that we think it's what you said, that older gray-haired man, right? We're beginning to see that that's shift. When we also think about what about educational levels? What are some assumptions we have about what's the base of, you know, people's training in this profession as part of the workforce?
Well, now most people you have to have some kind of college level, you know, degree or whatever, you know, for this particular workforce. But I do know I do know some inspectors who have been doing it for years and years didn't have to have that. They just started straight out of high school as an inspector and didn't have to have that college degree.
That's right. Okay, so that kind of leads to the last bullet on here, right? What's the history? What happened? What do we think led to the shift from male to female, from coming straight out of high school to now having a 4-year degree? What do you guys think are, what do we assume is leading to those changes? Or what do we know?
Honestly, I really don't know, because when I started, I had to have a degree.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I don't know where that shift was at when it changed from only having to have a high school diploma to having a degree. So I really don't know. I don't know if anybody else on the chat. Someone said they have gotten used to the training that we do in our profession.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't know when that shift happened.
Okay.
Or why.
Okay. I'm going to keep this moving, but this is helpful. And some of the things that you may or may not know about this, I may have some ideas about it, some assumptions about it that I'll share when we get to some future steps. But I think that this is helpful just even as a thought exercise for this group right now, to ask ourselves, what are we doing that's, moved us from old white gray-haired men or to more women, or from having a workforce that is, coming straight out of school, learning on the job, to now having a workforce that is going through a 4-year degree before they come into the field. I mean, let's, just recognize that those are some questions that we might want to reflect on as we go through the session. So as we are thinking about kind of how did we get here? What's going on? Recognize all of the things that got us here were a set of decisions. And there were sets of decisions made by previous people based on their own thinking. And here's the key. If you're thinking, you're biased. If you have a brain, you are biased. If you are a person acting, working, and engaged in the world, we're biased. It is how our brains are structured. And one of the things that we're learning from neuroscience that's so important is that by getting aware of how our brains operate and how they are biased, we can then begin to use tools and skills that we can manage or mitigate the bias that often leads us to recreating problems of the past or creating futures that we really didn't want. So in the work that we are doing in neuroscience and behavioral sciences, we're beginning to recognize that the more we understand, can name and label the bias, the more we're able to get control over it, the more we're able to get control over it, the more we're able to then modify our decision to reduce the bias that we have. And as we learn more about our brains, it doesn't make us less biased. Our brains are automatically biased. It just gives us tools that we can use to overcome that biological tendency. So let's take a look at what those tendencies are. Not too many years ago, I'm sorry I don't have the year right at the tip of my tongue, but Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics. And a big part of what led him to that prize was his distinguishing between two types of thinking and how those different types of thinking led to different types of judgments, particularly in the world of economics. And he labeled those types of thinking System 1 and System 2. As this image depicts the characteristics of a System 1 thinking pattern are the things that we have kind of in our intuition. They tend to be involuntary, like brushing your teeth or driving to work when you realize that you've just pulled into your parking deck and you don't really remember the last 5 minutes of your trip because it's so automatic. You're just doing it. It's effortless. And these are things that we have become patterned and ritualized. They're reflexive, and we do them very, very quickly. We also have system 2 thinking. System 2 thinking is what occurs when we actually have a challenge problem that's outside of our normal routine. If there's a detour on your way to work, you can't just show up at the parking deck and not know how you got there, because going through the detour, you noticed things that you don't typically see. You saw where there might have been an extra drugstore closer to your route than you knew, or there might be some particularly lovely plants that are blooming in a front yard that you wouldn't have seen had you not taken that detour. So we begin to concentrate a little bit more. We begin to construct a thinking pattern of, well, maybe I need to vary my route to work so I have a little bit of variation. Maybe I could come this way more often and pick up my prescriptions on the way home without having to make an extra trip. I begin to do some analytics. I begin to think about what the time or the gas or the other kinds of mathematical or analytical components of changing my route might mean. This is going to take some effort. It's not something that I'm going to do at the snap of my fingers, but it's going to require logic and reasoning. And if I were to leave work a little bit early, could I get that prescription before I picked my kids up at school, right? So it's that slower, more deliberative process. And in Kahneman's work, describing this and then illustrating a variety of different, what we call cognitive biases, and the ways in which we use what's called a heuristic. Heuristics become those little patterns that our brains use very, very quickly in order to do type 1 or system 1 thinking, when really it's a type 2 or system 2 problem. So when we are aware that we all have bias, our brains are physically organized this way, we need to be able to figure out all these. There already are more than like 150 different types of bias that we have identified. For example, you probably heard of confirmation bias, where we take information that we've already agree with and we consume more. That's a type of bias. We also have bias on framing. So you can go in, this is great for people who are in grocery stores or marketing environments, where you can have yogurt that's 90% fat-free or yogurt that's 10% fat. What happens in the grocery store is people will buy the yogurt that's labeled 90% fat-free, but there's nothing different about it than the yogurt that's 10% fat. It's a framing issue, but we often fall for framing bias, right? So how we frame things can lead us to make quick decisions when we really are not making a better choice. There are many, many different types of bias. And because of that, it's overwhelming. You can't keep up and have a checklist of 150 types of bias that you might encounter in your decision-making process. So the Neuro Leadership Institute is an organization that's emerged over just the last few years and really pulling together these threads of neuroscience, behavioral economics, all kinds of psychology and org behavior, and really figuring out how can we take what we're learning about neuroscience and package it in highly practical ways. And one of the things that they did was take all those many, many types of biases that we are uncovering and do a thematic sorting of them. And when they took them and put them in buckets that were similar, they found that those buckets were could be broken down into 5 categories, and they've used the acronym SEEDS in order to share what those primary common biases are. And I'm going to take us through the SEEDS model in just a moment. But the key here is that when you understand and can label and describe those type of bias, not only in your own thinking, but as leaders and working in teams, if you can teach your team to see those things and use that language, you can improve your decision making as groups, but you can also reduce the amount of error associated with that system one automatic thinking that may be leading you to things that are not really your best options. So we're going to look at the SEEDS model, and then I'll give you some strategies that you can use to begin applying that right now in your work. All right. So the seeds of bias, these are those big bucket categories that many, many types of bias fall into. The first type is described as similarity bias. And similarity bias is that we think people who look like us, think like us, come from our neck of the woods, people who have our kind of training, those are the people who are more like me, and therefore they are better than people who are not like me. This is a very common and frequently referred to in the literature around bias as in-group, out-group. And I know that if you are public health professionals and you are engaged in the North Carolina Public Health Association, we do in-group, out-group, even within our own profession. So the public health nurses versus the environmental health specialists, or the health behavior people versus the folks who are in, clinical settings. We have our own in-group, out-group bias even within our organizations. And that's a natural thing we do, but it is important to know that that's also a bias that may not be really very productive, and often is based on fairly superficial and artificial things. Honestly, Duke and Carolina are prone to the similarity bias. And so we laugh in our work, because we might have people in our offices who actually are rooting for the other side, right? And so when it's basketball or football time, all of a sudden those similarities become important, because who's wearing what color on what day. The expedience bias is a bucket of biases that have to do moving quickly, getting it done, making sure that if, my gut says it, then that must be the right choice. And I just, have a knee-jerk reaction, it's fast and I can move forward. And when we have that sense of the time machine that's kind of bearing down on us, we are high risk of doing what is already referred to earlier, confirmation bias, because the answer seems very obvious. It's right in front of me. I'm just going to do that because that's what makes sense. The third group of biases are based on our experiences. And these are where we feel like because that's how I did it, that's what's going to work for other people. Right now in our environments, we certainly know people who have said, I don't believe in COVID because I don't know anyone who has it, right? So that's an experience speaking. My perceptions, I know the world, I live in the world, therefore, if I haven't seen that, heard that, or experienced it, it can't be true for you, right? So that's the experience bias. Distance bias is really about the things that are familiar and that seem close by. We tend to trust the people who are in our family or in our organization or in our subgroup before we trust someone who's from another profession, from another part of the country, or from another culture, right? So we have this idea about it's similar to similarity, but it's also, if you think about in your daily work, it might mean it's a lot easier to go to the finance business office that's in your own agencies than go to the county's finance office to get the answer you might really need, right? So we do the short thing rather than the long thing. We go, well, it's easier for me to go to McDonald's than to go across town to get Whole Foods, takeout. Well, okay, there's the distance bias, right? Close is better, it's easier, it fits a lot of those buckets. And then the last one is really important, and this is back to Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and thinking slow, because we all fall for this, and it's particularly treacherous when we work in an environment where we have to think ahead. And the safety bias is about protecting what we have rather than losing something we might gain. So what Kahneman and his colleagues learned is that in experiment after experiment, people would make choices to avoid losing what they have, even if the risk of loss was much smaller than the potential benefit from the gain. And just as an example, if one person has $1,000 and another person has $200, and I offer both of them the opportunity to buy in on a very likely win in a new product development or service line, or even betting on a horse or whatever, right? So I've got a really good line. This is going to be a winning bet. Person A has $1,000, person B has $200. Which one of them is more likely to give me $100 toward this sure bet? Tanya, you want to put your voice out there?
I would say the person that has $1,000.
That's right.
Would more likely give you.
It seems like a less of a loss, but here's where if it's likely, it's a pretty likely scenario. The person who has $200 that might win an additional 100 would actually be getting a 30% gain on their investment, as opposed to the person who has $1,000 and is getting back just another 100. They're getting a 10% gain. So the risk seems greater to the person who has less, but the benefit is larger to the person who has less for taking the same amount of risk. And that it's kind of hard in our heads. That's that system 2 thinking. It's like, oh, it makes my brain hurt to think about that. But that's also part of why it's important to recognize that sometimes we need our brains to hurt and we need to slow down and think about that, because we tend to, these biases, go in system 1 and go pretty fast. Oh, well, that would be harder. That would take longer. That's not something I have experience with. I don't know anybody who's done that, so let's not do it. And there we are, not getting the benefit of what might actually have been a good win for us. So let's take a look and play now with our example. So we've been talking about workforce. So we had some found with similarity as a bias. I asked about what do people think about what that workforce looks like. So similarity was not so much an age, right? It was kind of, we have a variety of people we can ask about things. The other one we talked about, though, was education. And Tanya, you said, since you've been in the field, education, you've had the requirement for a bachelor's degree. When you think, and your colleagues who are in the chat right now, when you think about the people who are working in your field, do people have different types of degrees, backgrounds, or do they come in with a pretty common or similar set of skills into the environmental health world?
Well, of course, I know most everybody has some kind of science background. So I have my degrees in math and biology. I know people are getting environmental health degrees, so it's some kind of science-based degree.
Right. And that makes sense, right? So what we then might find is that because we see the world in that way and in that very, logical, systematic pattern, we might miss some of the things that are a little bit more emotional in people's decision making, or maybe there's data outside of the traditional testing that we do that we're not seeing because we've been led to use we're all similarly trained in how we approach it. So we didn't get the physics approach, right? Or as somebody who comes out of maybe a chemistry background instead of biology, right? There starts to be a little bit of, well, wait a minute. And so the question we can ask, and I put the mouth on this little character on purpose because I think we need to say these things aloud to ourselves and to our teams. When we find ourselves in a situation and we're looking at what we need to do, Are we really asking people, are we going maybe to the nurses or to the health behavior people or to the folks who work in a pharmacy or in maybe in agriculture? Let's get out of that, right? And are we giving our own internal information more weight? Are we only asking people who look like us? We're trying to do a strategic plan. Are we only asking other people who are in our area about what we ought to do strategically? That could be a bias. And so from a practice standpoint, when we think about our workforce, there's question, is this, way that we built things up, is the history of how we've gotten here. Maybe taking those kids out of high school meant that they didn't have some of the foundations, but also maybe taking some of those kids out of high school means that we lost some people who became really good environmental specialists because they got to college and they decided they were going to go into engineering or something else. And we kind of lost that window of opportunity to have somebody the work that we found so gratifying, right? So that similarity bias is one of the things that we can check right now in our decision making with others. The next one that we talked about is expedience. And expedience, particularly when we're looking at workforce. We've got to hire, we've got in the budget, and we've got a position down. This is my reality right now. I have 2 positions I'm trying to hire, and under COVID, everything's frozen. I have an expedience bias. I know I do, because as soon as we can leverage that money, I almost feel like as soon as I can get anybody in the door, I want to hire them, right? Because I'm so desperate for help. Going to give me the best candidate? Am I going to have looked carefully at what's out there, or am I going to be just responding? So Tanya, let me stop here for just a second, ask if there's anything in the chat or anything emerging that I should be paying attention to.
No, nobody's doing anything in the chat.
Okay, I'll just keep going. You holler at me if I need to, if I can't see you.
Yeah, I will.
So in this, pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay, so in this managing this piece of ask, are we doing something fast rather than something that might take more time? We could look at experience bias and, oh my gosh, this gets in our way, doesn't it? When we think that, well, here's how I did the search, so we ought to do it that way again. This is the point which we need to ask ourselves, are we giving preference to a certain approach that we've used before, rather than looking at how other people have done their searches? If we're using the same, I've seen this with searches and search firms that become quite well established in a geographic area, or being known for a particular type of qualified candidate, county manager, hospital, school superintendent, right? So these search firms that kind of build up their knowledge base, I think they have a bias of looking for people that meet certain qualifications. And if we begin to use the same search firms for lots of searches, we tend to see the same types of candidates being circulated through different positions. And you might have seen that as well. So if somebody was applying for an environmental department director position in one county, doesn't get the job, then the search firm will pop that person up in another county and maybe even another county. And if it doesn't work out so well in North Carolina, they might find that person interviewing in South Carolina or Tennessee or Virginia, somewhere proximate. It's not uncommon, but it creates that kind of experience bias where we see the same people who have been seen meet certain criteria, and that's as far as we're going. Distance, again, this is where particularly in our work, We may see who's in this meeting today, who's here and gets this information. A bias now around how you're starting to think about the things I'm introducing. And so the people who are in this room, attending this conference, hearing this session, we become more likely to have a conversation with those folks when we next interact with them about the things that we've learned, because we already have approximate knowledge of them. And that becomes more problematic, obviously, when it's not just this meeting, but it may be a policy meeting in your organization. And we have a group of the management team in the room, and we're talking about policy with people in the management team. We walk out of that room. Maybe I have a little side call with someone who is in my department, and maybe with the assistant health director. And we have another little combo. And then the next thing I know, I'm emailing and communicating with those few people who I had the hallway conversation with, because I'm closer to them in terms of what we've now talked about than all the other people who are in that policy meeting, right? We see this happen. It happens a lot. It's particularly challenging right now. We're in this remote world, but we need to ask ourselves, are we inviting input from people who are just in the room? Are we inviting people who are going to be affected, who are further from the decision-making process? And have we even narrowed who we're engaging with so that we might not be as completely exploring the options of what policies might work, because we've limited who we're talking to? Are we prioritizing close rather than far? And then the last part of our SEEDS model is safety. And we talked about earlier this fear of losing something. We prefer to gain money other than lose it, but that can also slow down our sense of taking a legitimate risk. When we become fearful of, taking anything that it might cost to get this new computer system, well, but that new computer system might actually be able to process claims faster, or do the lab results more quickly, or generate additional decision tree matrices that would really improve the quality of our service and make us more efficient in the field. But if we look at our overall budget and it's going to cost us 10% more in IT than what we've traditionally done, we might be reluctant to get that money and put it toward the thing that would save us in the long run if we don't really slow down and think about, am I going to have to give something up in order to get that gain? So what can you do with this? You can use it right now. You can use it right now just to begin to be aware of what the SEED model is, how the seeds of bias are in all of us and they influence our decision making. And the more that you work your mouth and share that set of definitions, share the examples, and share the language with the other people you work with, the more you will begin in the moment to address the things that could become challenges in good quality decision making. You can also, if you have a team of people who start to understand these biases and know how they work, you can set things up ahead of time to say, if we have a certain situation arise, then we are going to do X. And so if we're thinking about our workforce example here, if we have more than, say, X percent, and that says success rate. I think I was editing from somebody in terms of grading or education example. Apologize. But let's say we have more than 75 or 80% women apply, and we already have a lot of women in the workforce. Maybe we want to get a more diverse group to look at our applicant pool and help us figure out how we're going to balance that out a little bit, so that we get to the finalists that might help diversify our group. Mitigate at the source is another way you can use the SEEDS model by looking at what are we saying in our job applications? What are we doing in terms of how we even score the job that might limit or set a preference for the kinds of people that might apply? If we're open to people from other disciplinary backgrounds, you know, if you would take somebody who has a background in history, as long as they're willing to take a few classes, well, then are we even saying that in our job ads? If we're looking for people to come and diversify our workforce, are we being really good at making sure that when we look at those applications, we're not seeing anything that would tip us off one way or the other in terms of whether somebody is a male or female, black or white, red or green, right? We want to make sure that we are creating the most neutral at the source information so we mitigate the bias down the line. All right, so let me do a stop here for just a minute before I go on and ask Tanya, are there any questions, any observations, any just kind of thoughts coming in from you or your participants?
No, I haven't. Nobody's typed anything in the chat.
Okay.
Let me see here. I got a question. What about the management values differ?
Right. So
what about when management values differ? Sorry.
Right. Okay. So, but that's one of those. So I think this is really important question. I appreciate the person asking it. Okay. It's always important to recognize that no one model or no one approach is the panacea or the balm or the answer to everything else. Okay. Number one. Number two, if this is something that, and I can, you know, say to that person, or there's good evidence and growing evidence that using a thinking approach like the SEEDS model to reduce bias is a way to really improve efficiency. It has been shown to reduce the number of errors significantly in large organizations that have trained their people up on how to use this model. And so I think that I would get curious with someone who might say, oh no, we're not going to do that, as to what biases are affecting their thinking. Use this model to get curious about it. You know, what data do they have? What, you know, maybe they don't know anybody that has ever used this. So there's an experience bias, right? So you say, well, you know, one of the things that often limits our thinking is only using that people have used. Maybe there's some people who've used this who we don't know, but they've gotten benefit from it. Could we take a look at that, right? It's just, part of it is, and this is, you know, let's just be truthful. If we're going to make change, we have to be prepared to put ourselves out there to suggest some things that are different. Because if we don't, we're going to keep doing exactly what we're doing. That's really the bottom line. And if leaders are not willing to think differently, I think that this is where, you know, good managers and supervisors can give room to teams, can create opportunities for teams to try some things, pilot, get data and evidence about what happened when we did it this way instead of that way, and then come armed with some analytics behind you. That would be that's kind of how I would approach it. Other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, Carol in the chat also made a couple of the comments. She said, what about cultural pressures? She said most of the time those hiring are white, and then the unspoken expectations.
Yeah, so this is, so I really check that. One of the things help kind of people, we've gotten so touchy about bias as only about race. What I'm talking about affects everybody regardless of race, regardless of gender. If you have a brain, you're biased, right? This is not about picking on people by race. About understanding how we are all at risk of not giving people who look different from us credit for having a brain because we're biased that they don't look like us, right? That's clearly a racial bias that we're using. It doesn't mean that someone else isn't using that against us too. You know, it could be that a person who is Black looking at me might make an initial judgment about where I come from and what I, you know, believe about the world and how it works based on my physical characteristics. But that is bias on them as much as it is on me. So I think piece one is recognizing that bias is a human brain neuroscience. When they're doing neuroscience, they're looking at the brain inside the skull, and I'll tell you, there's no difference between once you cut through that top, everybody pretty much the same underneath, right? So there's that. And in terms of hiring and those kinds of decision making, I think this is the place where these tools become particularly helpful to say, if we really, and again, the evidence is extraordinarily clear, the more diverse the workforce, the more different ideas you are able to pull together, entertain, facilitate, and engage, the better quality your decisions are. When we make decisions based on limited experience with people who look like us, who are nearby, and we do it quickly, we are going to continue to get exactly what we've got. And so the only way out in hiring or any of these other things that we've got to do is to begin to build the ability to have conversations about how bias works and understand the benefits of thinking differently. This is critical skills. It's also called metacognition, which is thinking about how we think. And the more we think about how we think, the more we're able to begin to improve our thinking process. So I tend to continue to want to say to people who have a quick response that that won't work or that's not how we do it here, to say, well, let's slow down and see, why do we think that? What are the underlying assumptions about why we do it this way? Which maybe kind of leads us into the next thing. But let me ask Tanya, anything else in that I didn't hit yet?
Yeah, Carol also had stated about, I guess, maybe people that are overqualified.
Right. Well, there's a bias in that too, right? What are we saying when someone's overqualified? We might be making assumptions about them that, this is one of those things, particularly right now, right? People may be overqualified for the job you're offering, but that's the only job that they see open for them, that they're even close to being able to get. And that not getting that job or not applying for that job may be the difference between having food on the table or not having food on the table, right? So people may be overqualified, but not working, right? So we don't know, right? And then overqualified for the job, maybe, again, this is another, what do we know? Maybe the person was not happy with what they were doing. Maybe they found that was frustrating. I don't know, you have to ask. But I can't say that from that, how you, if you take gender, race, age out of your, mix, or where those kind of key biases are that would get you in your HR kind of stuff, I think at that point you're in a situation where you can start to ask, okay, what are the kinds of things we are looking for, right? What are the, is the person truthful? Are they willing to learn? Are they communicate well, right? You start talking about the things that really matter, and then a lot of that other stuff kind of goes away. But again, it takes slowing down to do that. All right, Tanya.
All right, that's
Anything
all I
else
have in the chat. No, I don't have anything else
folks.
right now.
Okay, so now we're going to shift. And we're going to shift now from kind of thinking about bias as just its own thing to thinking about how do we move into this future. And now that we know that we are already biased as we think about the future, we have certain things we're going to, that are defaults, right? So when we talk about what could be our instinct, the easy thing, the system one thinking is, oh, that would take too long, or oh, that would be too hard, right? And that's kind of the automatic. So this is where we're going to kind of thread these things together. We know in public health that change is on the horizon. It is already happening around us. And so the future of public health starts right now in 3.0, saying, first thing, we have to be chief health strategists. They put that out there. Who knows what that means, right? What is a chief health strategist? My boss and colleague, Anna Shank, is working with public health leaders across the country, and they're currently working on a set of cases and examples to really describe and define what does it mean to be a chief health strategist. And part of that is taking the things that we also know are part of Public Health 3.0, which is how do you bring people together and form those cross-sector partnerships? How do we begin to make sure that we are creating that professional public health network that can assure everybody has at least a baseline standard of quality and professionalism that's provided to them, that we have good data that we can use to inform decision making, and that it is as much as possible free of bias and helps us make good decisions, and that we enhance the funding for public health generally. When we think about the public health workforce that we're going to need to do the Public Health 3.0 stuff, what we're talking about today, folks, I'm here to tell you, we don't teach a lot of this at the School of Public Health. We're trying to improve our ability to help people become chief health strategists, but a lot of what we teach is how to look at the data, but not then what to do with it, not how to be strategic about it. So we've got work to do there. When we think about engaging community stakeholders, public health knows how to do community engagement, but it's that next part, cross-sector partnerships, where I think we are still trying to figure out, oftentimes, how do we get in the room? How do we get around the table? How do we get the people who really have power and influence to see us as legitimate and a part of their in-group, right? That they would want to have us at the table. As much as we might all be terrified, overwhelmed, and frustrated with what's happening with COVID, there's no question that putting a spotlight on what's broken has brought a lot of attention to the needs of our public health system. And so we have an opportunity right now to, never waste a good crisis, form cross-sector partnerships with people who are beginning to see public health as a really important part of the fabric of our communities. We talked about that accreditation, and this is where I want to come back to what we were talking about a little bit at the beginning of the session. And Tracy, you were saying, I'm not sure why we made these changes around people having to have undergrad degrees and that kind of stuff. This has been a trend in public health for some time, and it's a kind of push-pull. But part of it is just recognizing that we do have a level of sophistication in what we are trying to do as public health agencies. And in order to assure a level of service and of performance, people need a basic baseline of training and information. And typically we think of a 4-year degree as that kind of step in. Another part of that, though, I think also has had to do with, and my history in public health in North Carolina, going back into particularly like the early 2000s. And I think this still goes on to some extent, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But the idea that we would hire in a small county a new environmental health specialist, and in order to get that person registered as a sanitarian, they would have to go through their licensing and training hours and all the things that are required by the state in order to be licensed. And as soon as an individual would become licensed, then the neighboring county that was a little bigger and could pay a better salary would swoop those people up, and you would be back to square one in your smaller rural county, trying to find somebody who didn't have that certification, who would come in at a lower, and who would work to try to get them up to speed. And sure enough, once you got them trained, whoosh, they'd go again. So some of that kind of accredited health department training requirements and some of those things, I think have been, again, this is my assumption, but I'm putting it out there. I think some of what's going on with that was trying to level the playing field so that there would be a little less of the haves and have-nots. If every health department had to hire someone that had a 4-year degree, it would set a floor that would be a little harder to pick and choose from one to another. There's still some other challenges in there, but as I've seen what's happened in many of our health professions, I think professionalism, as the groups become more recognized, includes trying to of a standard for what people are expected to be able to do and how they're going to perform. So
I had a few more comments
please.
in the chat.
Yeah, good. Perfect.
It said the public health system moves very slowly. It takes forever to make changes, and that the public health wants to come to the table and then become the leaders.
Right. Yeah. So that's great, because here it is. So change does come slowly, but then it doesn't. It's both and. And so this is where we're seeing right now, and so I would strongly encourage people who are interested in thinking more about change. I did a presentation that is available on the YouTube link. It didn't play in Hopin, but it's available in your asynchronous. You can watch it whenever you want. But I talk about what is a crisis, what is change, and what's transformation. And when we are thinking about how slowly things change, it's true. And we also see very rapid change as a result of crisis, right? COVID. So when that happened, we had a real rapid reorganizing of how we were going to work. All of a sudden, I'm working from home. I'm not going to the office. My kids are doing school from home. They're not going into, the schools. We're, all, accommodating major shifts, our purchasing habits, our travel habits, all sorts of things, very rapid change. And our institutions have made big change. I mean, universities, big institutions, very slow to change, are doing all remote learning. Health departments have really reorganized and put people that were not doing, doing contact tracing are now doing contact tracing. So I think that the idea that we don't change is one of those biases, right? So that's a mental model that we have that I think we need to check. We just need to check. Is it because we can't or because we don't want to, right? And there are things about the Bureau and bureaucracy. And right now, when things are uncertain and somewhat chaotic, there is some comfort in having institutions that don't turn on a dime. There is some comfort in the stability that having things operate in a very standard and consistent way. There's some value in that. So while we can change rapidly when the circumstances require it, we also can decide what are the things that are important that we want to hold on to, that we don't want to let go of and change right away. And that's exactly at the crux of what we're getting ready to talk about. That tension right there is exactly it. How do we change without changing everything? But how do we change what we need to change without losing what we care deeply about?
Just a couple more comments. Yeah.
Sure. Good.
Carol,
I love it. It's great.
Carol had just put in there and said bureaucracy, and then she had said some of their employees know how to remain employed without working. Right.
And yeah, so there is clearly and again, that's another kind of bias, right? So there becomes this kind of belief. My experience is I don't have to work very hard, and and I'm going to still get a paycheck. I don't have to do anything different, and I'm still going to be able to come to work every day. And I'll talk about that in a minute, a little bit more. But Carol, you're absolutely right. And here's the thing I will say about that, is that it's okay to have people along that spectrum. The problem becomes when we are unwilling to question our decision making. It's when we assume that because one or two people say, oh, we can't do that, that just shuts it down, that we aren't hearing any other voices. When we let one or two voices dominate, then we are not doing we're not diversifying our thinking, and we're not going to do anything different. So there's some techniques, and again, more than what we can talk about here, but there are ways where you can set up processes where one of the things I like to use, particularly if there's a real power dynamic and you have people who have a loud voice, but they kind of shut everybody down. In my work at the School of Government, I would classically say it would be like the mayor who would just, have a real strong interest in getting a new fire station. And every time the board would meet, council would come together, the mayor would just go on and on and on about fire station. Everybody else would just start looking at their phones and, yawning and saying, well, can we move on? Well, so I come in a, facilitating retreat, and they're just freaked out because everybody's like, oh, the mayor's going to go on fire station. So one of the things that I do is I have people brainstorm in a process called an affinity diagram. And I give everybody a stack of sticky notes. And you can do this online as a Google Doc. But you have people respond to us anonymously. So you pose the question, what should be what are the top 3 or top 5 priorities for our budget in the coming year? And the mayor writes fire department. And then people go up and put their stickies on the board, or you see where they are on the Google sheet. And you realize that a lot of people said we need to improve the sidewalks, or a lot of people have said that we need to increase the support for our finance department, or whatever the other issues are. We need to get a new library, whatever. And there's only one question, there's only one statement sitting out there by itself about the new fire department. And if you start using these tools where people then start looking at where the priorities are, and you let people rank order and vote in ways that it's not just giving more weight to the mayor or whoever that power voice is in the room, the group decides, not the individual. And I think that's where we have to assert at different times tools to say, okay, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I know that's important to you, and I now want to be sure other people are thinking and what's important to them. So everybody's, options are in the room. And then once we have all those in the room, we will together decide which of these make the most sense, right? So it's just a process matter. And so a lot of, again, it's back to how do we teach people? And okay, here's a good example right now. I have a background that has nothing to do with what you guys do in biological sciences, right? Not my field. But what I'm talking about right now is probably helpful if you had some skills in it. And this is one of these places where what's your experience background and what, who you're talking to. If I talk to a bunch of people who sound like me, we'll go on and on about different tools and methods and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, you're stuck, not able to get that one loudmouth to say, we all want to do something else. Would you please shut up, right? So we need to cross-fertilize and give different voices and different ideas room so that we can see and try them on, see how they fit, work in that slow system 2 thinking a little while and see, well, maybe this isn't as bad as I thought. My previous, quick reaction, now that I've had time to sit down and study it a little more, that quick reaction doesn't really appeal to me anymore. So in order to get there, though, and this is one of the things I just want to say quickly, this scenario approach that I'm getting ready to introduce here, and I want to be sure that I kind of walk us through it because I know we don't have endless time. But the work of doing futuring and thinking really long term is not something new to public health. This is a cover of a report you can find online, but it's 2000. Oh shucks, I didn't put the date on it. This was done in the 2000s, I think maybe 2010, 2009, maybe even. With Robert Wood Johnson, Kresge Foundation, and the Institute for Alternative Futures. They brought stakeholders from around the country together to think about the future of public health. And they were thinking about 30 and 40 years out from where they were, right? So this was a really long-term perspective. And it wasn't long ago where I actually heard someone interviewed on one of the things this group did almost 20 years ago was one of their scenarios was pandemic. And the person on the radio was saying, oh my goodness, you were, really, had a lot of insight to do that. And he said, no, we were just using the tools of foresight. It was one of the things in public health that we knew is very likely to happen at some time. And we just played the scenario out. So what we're going to talk about right now is nothing new to public health, and it's nothing new to the base of science that we know how to use. What is using this in a way that we begin to think about what we're doing in our own spheres of influence and starting to bring these tools in. And I'm going to share with you a 4-step process that was described by Richard Lum. Lum is the president of a futuring organization. He's published a book called 4-Step Planning, Foresight or something like that. I've got the title, I'll tell you what it is. But the focus of his work, and I think is at the University of Hawaii, is really to build the toolkit for people to do that kind of future thinking. And as you can see on this slide, what he describes is that, when we're trying to innovate, when we're trying to do something new, you have a zone at the very beginning he calls the foresight zone. And if you think about right now is at that intersection of your X and Y axis, right? So when we're talking about the public health workforce that would be in our future at 2040, 2050, somewhere in there, we are pretending kind of out into that time of where the professional futurists would go, because what we're trying to do is anticipate what would we need to do in this coming time frame to have the kind of workforce that would be what we want to see about the time that we're going to be leaving. And as we get that set up and that starts to take on some, let's say in 10 years from now, people start doing stuff that's getting that next workforce ready. And then in about 15 years from now, we'll start to see academic programs. We'll start to see new training and certificate programs. We'll start to see all sorts of new innovations that are now starting to prepare that new public health workforce that we say we want to create. We've got to get that going. And in some ways right now, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but you can certainly see exactly this phenomena happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. If you think about the work that was done by Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Rosa Parks and others in the civil rights work of the 1960s, and what happened in terms of their seeing a future where let freedom ring, right? That every Black child and white child would be able to grow up, be judged on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Think of that March on Washington, in 1966, 67, where Martin Luther King spoke and John Lewis spoke, right? That was in the foresight zone. And then we had all the kind of thinking that we'd done stuff and that we kind of had overcome with some affirmative action and all that. And then we've gotten into this place now where we still are seeing issues around Black people being disproportionately affected by COVID, Black and brown people being disproportionately restricted in terms of where they can live, what kinds of jobs they can have, what kind of wealth they are able to acquire, where Black and brown people are disproportionately incarcerated for things that all of us do, right? We don't see the opioid epidemic putting all the white guys in jail, but we saw the cocaine and crack epidemic putting Black guys in jail. We are all looking at diseases of despair. And so where we are now is in that reactive zone where we're starting to say what we've done, all these things on civil rights, we are now seeing Black Lives Matter in the streets. It is reactive to the things that we've been saying for years. And I think many of us believe that it won't be too long before the new normal is different, that we are going to be operating in a much more multicultural, diverse, and younger and more, mixed up world. There's no way it's happening, and there's not much we can do to change it. The curve is moving, right? So the same is true for workforce. We've got things we know now. We need to think ahead so that by the time that movement starts to come, we've got some stuff in place. So what do we need to do? We've got two things that we got to do simultaneously. One is the analytics, doing the slow thinking, the math, the getting the data. How did we get here? And then the synthesis of saying, if we want it to be different, how do we reframe? How do we rethink what it could look like? So here's the data. What was in the past? Where are we now? What kind of things can we anticipate? And if we want it to look different, what would we need to do differently to get that to happen? So the key questions that Richard Lum puts out there, if we think about not just change, but really trying to create a future, he says, what do you want to change? And what do you want to stay the same? Why do you want that? And how would you go about it? So his process has 4 steps. And he starts with the past, asking, how has the issue changed over time? How's it changed in the past several years? And why did changes happen? Now, why did we see more women coming into environmental health? Why did we see the shift in more 4-year degrees? What led to those changes? Why did those happen? As we look at what we currently have, what are still going on? Are we still seeing a push for more educational requirements and making more stringent the ways in which people in your profession need to accomplish certain milestones and things before they can move forward? What are the new sources of change that you can see happening right now around us? And what do you think might slow down or prevent some of those changes from happening? If you think about just the next 5 years, the near future, the things that you see happening right now, what are some of the most logical, likely things that you're expecting? In the workforce, I think many of us are quite concerned because of the high number of people who are eligible for retirement in public sector work generally. And as Tanya, you said earlier, that may or may not be so true for your immediate group of people and professionals, but we certainly see in public sector generally a pretty high number of people who are eligible for retirement. And we talk about it as the silver tsunami, for example, right? But to do the future foresight work, we've got one more step, and that's about aspiration and dream. And what is it that we really would want to see in our long distant future, 20 years, 30 years from now? What are the strengths and the things that we have right now that we feel proud about that we would want to see in our retirement being still present in our organizations? What are the kinds of things we would like to create? So Ludlum's 4 steps are just these 4 things, but he has method for each one of them. And I'm just going to show you simply just a few tools that go through this process. And I'll, again, play a little bit with the idea of thinking about this in terms of workforce. So in step one of the tools, and I have used this similar kind of tool with a lot of work with governing boards around strategic planning, and it can be very, very helpful in getting particularly people who are unfamiliar with the organization's history to see how we got this way, but it's also very valuable for thinking about where on a good point forward. So if you think about a timeline, and this one is just theoretically from 50 years ago up to kind of moving into present time, if I were doing this with an organization, I would start with what year was the organization founded, and there would be a little bit pre that, what led to the organization being set up. And then we would go across that, looking at what are the eras. Well, this, sometimes, for example, you'll say that was the era of our health director, John Smith, and he served for nearly 20 years in this community. And, the way that this health department operated under him and what happened was, really led under this kind of era of his leadership. You might have things that are cultural touchstones, which might include, this Mr. Smith having had a major life event to a recognition of the importance of having women in leadership roles. Maybe his daughter or someone, was rose to a point where, this guy saw the fact that, life is changing and the world around us is changing, and we're starting to see the shifts in the community around us. And I think maybe I'm going to bring a woman in as my assistant health director, and that's really driven by a much larger cultural movement to putting women into leadership. And so maybe Smith does that. And then maybe as Smith retires and the assistant doesn't get the job, somebody else comes in for a few years, and then that person peters out, someone else comes in for a few years and peters out. Maybe the milestone is finally that woman is given the position as the health director, and that's a milestone change for the organization. It could also be a milestone in we've went from being a single county health department to a district. Maybe the milestone is we went from being a single health department to a consolidated agency, right? All of those things are familiar in our language, and we can see how those things happen across time. So as you think about a layered timeline, you have different events that are occurring and having influence, but along each of these, we also are asking ourselves, what was going on in the daily life of people? What practices and experiences, what expectations did they have when Mr. Smith was the health director? What were the systems they used? What kind of infrastructure did they have? Were they going out on a horse and buggy? Did they have laptop computers, or did they always have to come back to the office to put their stuff in? Who made the rules? What were the institutional requirements? And what were the values? What were the narratives, and what were the assumptions that people were making under these different time zones? And what is that we still have as part of our story? When we think about step one is really about getting a really clear picture of this past and understanding how it shapes where we are now. So then we move to step two. Well, let me ask before I do this, any questions or anything, Tanya?
No, there's none.
Okay, I'll just keep going. You'll stop me if I need to. Okay,
Okay.
So in step two, we are now saying, okay, now we're in the present. And what are the things, if we think about that past and what's kind of been happening, what are the social trends that we see now? And how are those informed by those historical events? Are we seeing past recur that we've seen in the past, or is this new? What about technology? What's happening? What about economics? What's going on there? What's happening environmentally? And what's happening in the political arena? So this is called a STEEP scan, and we use this as a kind of stakeholder analysis framework, and you can take that model and look at where we are in terms of the changing workforce and say, well, you know, these baby boomers are all coming in to retire, and technology, well, golly, you know what? We're really looking at more technology, and a lot of these old, excuse my language, I'm one of them, don't want to learn how to use this new stuff, or confused by it, or frustrated by it. Economically, maybe if they've been working for 20, 30 years, maybe they're in a place where they could retire. And if they don't retire, so this is kind of the reverse problem we have people in some of our roles, certainly at the university, who are in their late 60s, 70s, and up, and they don't want to retire because they're still, you know, thinking and teaching and, you know, staying active and engaged in the world around them. But because economically, they now are at the top of the salary band and they're not retiring, we are creating some problems because we don't have the revenue from those retirees as state employees to put back into hiring new in ways that are competitive because those salary dollars are tied up, right? So economically, these are trends that we kind of have in terms of this older baby boomers. What do we do about that? How do we help support them? But right now, where we've got an economic downturn, do they have enough cushion? I mean, there's a lot in there, right? Environmentally, we're talking about shifts in terms of can people afford to retire where they currently work? Are there environmental pressures? Can they, you know, are they in a coastal area, or some of you maybe in the mountain? Are there things happening environmentally that have to do with climate change or larger infrastructure issues in the environment that, you know, maybe you can't get broadband, and so trying to stay and work in this area at a distance is just not going to work. So maybe it's easier for me to just my job and start over somewhere else. Those are environmental factors that may play in. And then certainly there are political pressures around what kinds of you know, public support are we going to have? How do we get people elected who will provide help to the public health and local governments that are responsible for hiring and maintaining? I think this is a useful framework to think about just in terms of what the forces are, but it also is a framework to think about who are the people in these different sectors, and if we were going to make change, if we were going to move forward with a new vision for the future, who are the different actors or champions in these sectors who we would want to have on board with us. As we think about those different sectors, we can also apply that kind of steep scan to different levels. And in our public health work, we are able to think around that social ecological framework at ways in which a steep scan or other kind of analytical tools could be used to look at just who are the clients in our programs and what's affecting the people who we see in our direct service lines. What about the agency as a whole and all of our different units, not just environmental health, but health education, primary care, health promotion, maternal and child health, nutrition. When we start looking at all of the different services that we have, who are the stakeholders, and if we did a steep scan for the agency, what would that look like? And we could take that out and say, well, we don't work alone as a health department, particularly if you're a consolidated agency. At this role, your service system is going to include your social service and mental health, but also probably a number of other referral groups, including nonprofits, maybe your local hospital and others, who are part of the service system that you've created. And then you have your full population out of that largest band, where when we think about, you know, what the steep scan would say about what's happening at the population level, there are different forces that are influencing out there than there are just within our service system or within our agency or within our client groups. So as you are thinking about the present, we can slice and dice it in different levels, but it's important to recognize before we make a plan, we got to know who we're planning for and who are the people who are affected and affect that plan. And do they have a voice in where we're trying to go? So that's step 2, a couple of things that would happen there. In step 3, we start to get into that place. Okay, we know what our history is now. We've looked carefully and analyzed what we have going on in our current environment. So now, where do we want to go? And the first step in step 3 is to start to try to articulate what the forecast. And I've given 3 examples here of different ways to write a forecast. And it is, I was looking at some data from the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice published in 2015, so about 5 years ago. They said that 38% of the public health workforce were planning to leave their current positions before 2020. So I use that number, that 38% came from a study of public health workforce and where it would be this year. So I started with that. So as of 2020, this year, an estimated 38% of public health workforce will leave the workforce. So if we start with that, that's not a predictive statement. That's just really, that frames where we are right now. Doesn't help us. The next and better frame would be to say, okay, between now and 2025, 5 years from now, the proportion of public health workers who would leave the workforce would decrease from 38 to 35%. So now we actually have a short period of time and we have a factor that we measure a change in. But if we're really going to be making a long-term difference and we're talking about futuring, we have to really push out further. And so this is to say between 2020 and 2035. So now I'm pushing that 15 years out, and the proportion of public health workers to leave the workforce will decline from 38 to 15% or less. Well, where's that 15% coming from? I went and looked at what is a sustainable and healthy turnover rate. And guess what? It seemed to be about 10% is what they say, 10 to 15. And so that's looking at different sectors and looking at what is a Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they're kind of saying right now in 2019, the average turnover rate for education and healthcare generally, that's not public health, that's just all education, all healthcare, is 1.3. And for government, all government is just 1.0. So when we are at 38%, we're talking, it's at the 3.8, right? Out of 100%, right? Or if you're looking at, we make our scale the same. What's going on? Why are we so much higher in public health? What's that about? That would be a place we would go back and ask, what's leading to that trend and what do we need to understand about that? Tanya, any questions? I'm still rolling.
Nope, you're good. No questions.
Okay, so when we get to this place where we've started to think about kind of what's our future scenario, what Lum says and what people who do futuring say is we need to look at, there's the past right over here. I think you guys can see my mouse, right? Here's our present. And then what we want to do is we want to think about scenarios. We want to forecast out different possible futures. If things change a lot and we were to really kind of get over some of these assumptions about what kind of people come into public health, or we were going to get new funding for public health, or we were going to get some really kind of wild card things that, you know, we're going to tackle COVID, we're going to increase the public health workforce so that we are robust again, and we're going to really strengthen this, you know, charge to try to improve the quality of everybody's life and reduce the disparities and inequities, right? So that could be like best case scenario. In the middle are these low change. We just keep going as we go, and we're just kind of plugging along. We don't change a lot. There's a little bit in there. And then there's also the possibility of high change that could be bad. And so what we would do is we would get different scenarios, some that would go into that zone of high aspiration. If we could have our best of all possible worlds, what would that look like? And in that zone of conventional expectations, if we do what we're doing and don't make a lot of change, what do we think might happen? And then a zone of growing desperation. What would look like if we really started to lose control over what we need to do and who's coming in and how the work would be done? So in our future casting, what Lum says is let's, actually push ourselves in articulating what a continuity of, this one he actually had, and I used his. This is a scenario based on work he did with a healthcare system. So in theirs, they said scenario A was that patients would go to a clinic, they would get treatment, they would have insurance, and they would get better. So that would be like a good kind of moving forward. If we keep kind of incremental and don't change a lot, but kind of a little bit of change, use more telehealth, increase kind of the use of mobile pop-up clinics, and get a few more people in community engaged with what we're doing. If we do an incremental chance, we start getting some other innovators to develop new technologies and approaches to healthcare. Maybe we start giving people monitors that they use in their homes rather than telehealth. Maybe they start having their own ways to test and manage their disease, to really thinking about social determinants of health. And we kind of move in a very kind of incremental but kind of higher impact upstream way. And then that disruptive, or kind of, what would be a big abrupt change would be, what if all of a sudden, because of the COVID crisis, all of a sudden we have healthcare for all, and we expand Medicaid and everything. There's a huge shift, and all of a sudden we have resources, right? It would just overturn kind of the current way we think about doing care, because we would, all of a sudden, everybody would be able to get care, and we wouldn't have the same infrastructure would not be appropriate for what we might have if that were to happen. So you can see, 4 different possible futures, and we could do the same thing if we were to play with our example. Because of time, I'm not going to do it here, but this is where you would take this worksheet. Well, if things stay the same, we kind of have continuity, what would that look like? People would still apply for our jobs in the way that we have. Incremental low change, well, maybe we would have a few more positions, or maybe we would have maybe a partnering with a local college where we would start to do some apprenticeship training or something like that. Incremental high change, maybe we actually start to build a pathway for people outside of our traditional degree plans to start coming in. Maybe we start looking for people with history, English, business backgrounds, and other kinds of professions to start helping us think more creatively about how we environmental health. And that abrupt disruptive would be, we've got major environmental crises, and the rate of climate change is coming really fast and hard, and we need a much different and much more advanced workforce that's going to do more than restaurant and well and septic and that kind of inspection, but that's really going to start mitigating big issues around flooding and kind of planning and zoning, and working with a whole different set of partners and activities, maybe helping rehab homes to make them more protected against natural disasters, right? So in creating those different scenarios, what is the last kind of tool in that step 3 is to say, okay, we've done kind of A, B, C, D. Now, if we look at those, are there some things on each of those lists that are similar? And I'll tell you all, I did this similar kind of activity with a group of professionals in the North Carolina Public Health Leadership Institute almost a year ago. And we played with the workforce issue when we did this. And I asked people, whether they did strategic planning. We pretty much everybody said they did. And we talked about when people, thought they would retire, and it was right in this 2050 band. And we said, all right, I'm going to have A, B, and C groups, divided them into 3 groups. Group A, best case scenario. We've got more resources. Everything is going better than we ever imagined. Group B, things stay the same. Group C, things get worse. And we're really in crisis. Think about what we would want to see for the public health workforce in 2050 if we have these different scenarios. Everybody did their small group work, and then we came back and we made lists. And we had a list of things that would happen if things went well. We had a list of things that would happen if we kind of stay the course. And we had a list of things that would happen if things got worse. After we put all the lists up on the front of the board, we stopped and stepped back and looked at the lists. On every list, there were 2 things. We needed to increase the salary and support for people in the public health professions. The jobs were not paying enough, and no matter what we did, we needed to have better salary scales. And 2, we needed student loan forgiveness. We needed to have people be able to choose public health as a career without feeling saddled by excessive student loans that they would never pay off. So that's what sits right in the middle. That's the crossover stuff. What was powerful to me was, one, that those came up on all 3 lists. But even more powerful was when I asked the folks in the room who said they had strategic plans, how many of their strategic plans had anything about salary increases or student loan forgiveness? What do you think?
Probably none.
None. So we're not doing right now what we know, no matter which way we go, those are things that we need to be thinking about. That's where this can help us start to use and stress test our current strategic plans. Are we doing right now what we would need to do to reach the desired future that we want? So when you start thinking about this as an approach to kind of going beyond strategic planning and moving into that step of what's that long-term aspirational dream, ask yourselves, what are the 5 things about where we are right now that are really important to us, that we would want to make sure we hold on to, that we don't let go of? What are 5 things from our history that are really critical about our values and who we are, and that really are kind of foundational milestones, eras, cultural things that really have helped shape what we now want to continue to do? What about these different scenarios when we thought about A, B, C, D? What are insights that we gain from that? Who possible partners might be? When we do those different scenario plans, what are the kinds of folks that might be important to help us, and what kind of resources might we need to be thinking about? And then what are those, looking at all those things, what are 5 things that now we can begin to say about what kind of future we want to help create? What's the picture of where we want to go that's built on our history, that respects and honors the present, that helps anticipate and grow us in directions that, no matter what the future holds, gives us something to hold on to? So in that last step 4, it gets back to something Carol said